Yeah, hello. How about a 60-second book review? I'm an Oxford qualified psychologist who teaches people how to learn more easily, and I'm also a speed reader. So I'll time myself reading this book and give you a bit of a précis. It's so funny. It starts out by saying if you've got ADHD, I know it's not likely you'll finish this book. Well, I'll show you. Okay, hang on. Oh, this is super useful. This is so useful. He's splitting ADD into 7 different categories. And they're actually things I haven't seen, which is amazing because this is something I deal a lot with. Okay. Yep. Okay, well, that's kind of known to me. Yeah. There is an awful lot that one can do about it. That is so interesting. I've already got some friends I've got to call because it explains it so beautifully. Yeah, and it does in fact vary throughout life. Oh, well done, Angelica and Crystal, spelled strangely. So good. He's giving a whole bunch of different case studies which really neatly describe the different 7 categories that he's coming up with. Okay. Good grief. Funnily enough, okay, I think that I must actually bring this up quickly. It's speaking about, I have ADHD myself, and it speaks about one of the big things, the last 3 pages have been talking about, one of the big things about ADHD being distractibility. Now, I find speed reading way better for that because it's sufficiently difficult that either I'm sucking completely and I know, just put the book away, you're not actually reading, or if I'm doing it, it demands my mind so much more that it breaks that distractibility thing. Sorry, that's an aside and I've wasted 30 seconds explaining that, but let me, okay. Ironically, distractible, ne? Hang on. Yeah. Yep. Okay. He's explaining the neurobiology of it. Okay. Yeah. 4 circles which he uses as a means of understanding how it impacts you. Okay. Ooh. Okay. So he's talking about head injuries. That's why I kind of like felt it. It's all part of the physiological aspects of it. That's one of the 4 circles, and it's going into social stuff too. Yes, I find it so interesting. So, waist to height ratio being a predictor. It's so fascinating how so often people think that these things, hey, you're just making it up. It's like, no, there are literal physiological markers. There are things you can scan in the brain and look at in the body that indicate. Anyway. Yeah. He's talking about the relationship between ADHD and other disorders. Now here, this is the one that I'm going to find most interesting, I think. How in the 80s did Zametkin start to characterize the things that eventually turned into his different types? Okay, this is very interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. Sorry, this ring of fire is one of his categories that he describes ADD wise. And it was so interesting thinking about how it relates. And he actually then links it to bipolar sort of stuff. It's very interesting seeing this kind of overlap and how some mental disorders, which people could categorize otherwise, could easily be a form of ADHD. Be careful though. Some people say it's ADD when it's like, no, honey, you know, something different, but very interesting. And how it overlaps with anxiety disorders. And throughout this, he's talking about the SPECT scans of the brain, SPCT scans of the brain, which indicate which kind, and there's a clear correlation between certain parts of the brain which indicate whether you are which of the sevens. That ring of fire one, inattentive, classic, he gives the different seven. Hang on. Taking a while because I just find it interesting. Yeah. And he's giving all sorts of case studies looking at how the basal ganglia in the brain are interfered with. Now he's going on to the cerebellum, basal ganglia being central, ironically, anyway. The impulsivity of inattentive. This one I found really interesting, the over-focused ADD type, which naturally overlaps with spectrum things, like more broadly. Sorry, see, ironically, I was then sucked in here. These SPECT studies are really interesting. See, this really is so important. A lot of the thing is that often people try harder, and that doesn't work if you don't have the underlying things in place. So if someone, just to use a metaphor, if someone's got spinal injury, they can't just try harder to walk. It's like there's an underlying issue, which is meaning that they can't do things. And often that is the case with ADD or ADHD. And this is talking about temporal lobe ADD. So that particularly is so physiologically based that there's no point in saying try harder, when it's like, no, we've got to deal with the underlying physiological cause. See? And then it gets exacerbated with environment. So it's talking about John, and John's grandmother was a drug addict and she was caring for him. So the already significant issues were exacerbated with it. Hang on. Now, good. He's talking about how is it different from temporal lobe epilepsy, which is, okay, obviously there is a great difference. Mm-hmm. Yep. Interesting, which would explain some of the impulsivity that is often seen with ADD. It's talking about the limbic system, so the emotional regulatory system within the brain, and how that can be one of the categories of ADD, the limbic ADD type 5, which he's discussing, have got those emotional regulatory issues. And so, And how interesting. Even talk about drugs. Sorry, and how there can be a predisposition. That is so interesting. How not always. You see that what is so good about this book is that there are these different forms of ADD, and that's one of the reasons it's under and overdiagnosed. And in this case, this ring of fire ADD is often associated with kind of irrational thoughts because of emotions sort of flying off very ridiculously. Yep. Environmental hypersensitivity is a very common feature amongst that. Okay, there's so much I'm learning, which is amazing because ADD is something I deal with all the time, and even that I have. So, okay. Yeah. Well done, you. It's just nice hearing when people actually overcome it and do well. Yep. Oh, there's a Paul. Oh, see. And Karen. Hang on. Yeah, there we go. It's interesting how this marijuana abuse is common. It's come up a few times, which sort of makes sense, especially if there is an anxious form of ADD, or if there's, because, you know, it can temper those thoughts and not have the kind of runaway thoughts that can sometimes happen. So thought perseveration would be the formal term, can be interrupted, which is interesting. Yeah. And yeah, sorry. I'll say that after. Let's wait for this. One of the things I'm liking is by saying that there is actually an issue. If people recognize what the issue is, so instead of just saying, oh, something is wrong with me per se, saying that there is something which can be attended to, then gives people agency. They can act in a different way to overcome that stuff, which I think is really good. Yeah. Okay. I won't mention that one on a... Sorry, it was slightly PG-13. Yeah, noise sensitivity. Yee, that can happen with me. Excessive talking. I can't relate. Says me, even in the middle of reading and halving my speed because I'm... It's so interesting how... Yeah, this book is really good for a number of friends. And it's so interesting. Some of it doesn't relate to me even slightly. But again, the fact that he splits it down into the 7 makes it much better because then it makes sense. It's like, okay, half of the stuff really resonates, the other half not. But it would make sense because I'm not ring of fire, for instance, or temporal lobe. I suppose I'm a lot more classic. Yeah, no kidding. Well, let's talk about the issues of the ADD at school. And, well, I mean, me in a nutshell in high school. Sorry, just because it's my wheelhouse now. Because I teach people how they can study better. So I work with teenagers all the time, and that's really what that last section was talking about. It's really relevant to know that ADD people often learn in unconventional ways, and they can often learn very well, but not if they pretend that they can learn in boring, regular ways. That just ain't going to work. Okay. This is lovely because he's holistic. So he speaks about ways that you can intervene not only cognitively and behaviorally and emotionally, but even spiritually. And I think that's important, like all the aspects of us and how that can play a role. Now, this is an interesting one. Okay. Yep. Yeah. Okay, that stuff I kind of knew quite a lot about, which was speaking about dietary impacts on ADD. Like, for instance, I know that I have a chronic allergy when it comes to aspartame, so which is an artificial sweetener, and the ADD people in general actually tend to respond badly to certain substances, especially the general rule of thumb is the more artificial, the worse. And especially with ADD or ADHD people, try and avoid that. I've taught kids over the years who had chronic concentration issues, and it turned out that once diet was addressed, 3/4 of the problem went away. So I find that really interesting. Okay. Yeah. I do hate the term superfood, but nonetheless. Yeah. Yeah. The SPECT test has to be one of the most useful things that this book gets into. The scans and the overall tests to indicate it's really... Yeah. Gosh. And I like that he is talking about, he's now splitting up different interventions based on the different kinds that you get of ADD. And what I really like is how he's very holistic. So there are sometimes that pharmaceutical, medical kind of interventions what he goes for, but there are other times that completely different approaches are offered. Because for me, and I'm not judging, I know that my ADD or ADHD did not respond to the medications that I tried when psychologists said, oh no, he's got to get on this. I responded much better to differing study technique, well, like the speed reading, for instance, which stimulated my brain much more and made me work an awful lot more efficiently and quicker. And I like the fact that it's holistic because there are different strategies. It's not a one-fit-all approach kind of thing, one size fits all. It's so interesting. So, for instance, Wellbutrin is what he would suggest for type 6 ADD. So, the Ring of Fire that I've mentioned a few times, apparently he'd say, not the limbic kind. He would suggest Wellbutrin, whereas he would suggest completely different things, like 5-HTP, for instance, for Ring of Fire stuff. And I love that. He's giving you the environmental, the medical, the behavioral kind of changes depending on what your issue is. I think really, really useful. Yeah, there we go. And tricyclic antidepressants for anxious kinds. So it's the same sort of idea. Ha! And now he's talking about the different brainwaves and how neurofeedback training mechanisms can help you deal with stuff. Really good. Yeah. Fantastic. Now I'm looking forward to this bit. Okay. Optimizing the ADD life. Because the bottom line is, I know this. People can lead broad lives once they work in a slightly different way. I often think that ADD or ADHD can be, and a lot of neuroatypical things can be a superpower if worked with. So, yeah. Cool. Okay, this is denser. Yeah. This is wonderful because it also is like, what do parents do? Yeah. Yeah, it's wonderful. So, a few things. The one thing is, often people with ADD or ADHD, not only, but any kind of neuroatypical people are very often going to butt heads with their parents in really bad ways. Not necessarily because the parents being evil, but if someone sees the world in this way, and you now have someone who's seeing it in that way, of course, things are going to clunk together. The gears really aren't going to work well. And there's giving an awful lot of ways of parents sort of understanding and adapting to how the child works, so that things, okay, for instance, if you set the gears can suddenly move better, if you set very clear goals, communicate effectively, and there are strategies that will plug in to the different kinds of ADD or ADHD you have. And in that sense, it also reminded me of the work of John Hattie. John Hattie is an educational professor, and he speaks about how learning, I can't get into it obviously because I'm already taking way too much time on this, is often facilitated if made visible or explicit. If a student can literally see what they already know and what they need to know next, so they can progress step by step and see what they're supposed to do, what he calls visible learning. And in many ways, this chapter, which was talking about parenting and family strategies that can deal with ADD and ADHD, a lot of it made these implicit assumptions, which often get disconnected because the dad might have ADHD and the daughter might have ADHD, but they're different kind. So there are disconnects. But if you make it explicit and stated, and it's actually objectively out there, it makes communication a lot easier. So, yeah, very interesting. Yeah, there we go. Oh, yeah, completely. Oh, shame. Yeah, it's lovely. Oh, and now the teachers, what are they supposed to do? A lot of detail here. That's a tiny bit slower because... flip, this is so interesting. Yeah, brilliant. Also ties in with the John Hattie stuff. So we'll just call my DPN, a daily progress note. Like, if a kid can see that they're getting better all the time, like literally journaling almost, writing down where was I and where am I going. Absolutely. Side note, it's talking about sleep as it relates to ADD. All people, I would say if there's one thing which one should do, it is sleep well. I mean, obviously it gets a little bit more complicated than that, but if I was going to say the quickest way of improving your psychological well-being and mental health, it's so often a good sleep pattern, good sleep hygiene, as psychologists sometimes call it. And so important for people with ADD, often because they've got very bad sleep patterns, not always, but... Oh, this is so good. I'm so going to use this in my class. 13 different suggestions as to how you can sleep better. Some of which I already teach, actually, but many in which I don't. The meditations I teach. Yeah, there we go. Ways of controlling negative thoughts. 8 really useful steps. So, yeah. I love how research nowadays so often speaks about individual values. It's really a world shift in understanding how motivation works. Sorry. The page is stuck together. This is so good. So practical. Oh, and also the previous generations can be in denial that maybe something kind of needs help. I know that in terms of people avoiding like therapy and stuff like that. No good reason, prejudice. Same thing with neuroatypicality. Yeah. Brilliant. And now it's just the acknowledgements, but yeah, that is very nice that you have lovely people in your life. Okay, I took ages on this book, but flat out, one of the best ADD resources that I have ever read. So now, let me just give the basic point is by dividing ADD into these 7 broad types and categorizing in such a way that we can understand behaviors that tend to be associated with that, he's really given a broader way of understanding an issue which affects loads of people, and then gives different suggestions as to how one can deal with that environmentally, biologically, what medications can work, what therapeutic interventions are more likely to work. Because if you try and help an ADD person with temporal issues, for instance, temporal lobe things going on, in the same way as classic ADD, it's not actually that likely to work. Or an anxious ADD style is likely to be very different from the ring of fire kind of thing. So I think that that is an incredibly useful one. And then he goes into what you can do as the person with ADD or ADHD, and especially what can parents do, what can teachers do. And from that point of view, I obviously work with hundreds of schools all around the world. If you are one of the teachers who is dealing with the needs of a kid, and ADD happens to be a common one, which it will be. I mean, if you're a teacher who works in that capacity, this, I think, should be on your shelf, because it describes things beautifully, everything from how diet can be changed. And these SPECT scans was so interesting. Now, he makes it clear that SPECT scans do not in and of themselves give the diagnosis. All a SPECT scan is, and it describes a process of someone literally going in and a drip gets put in, and a movable camera that is checking your brain activity will indicate after the scan. It's sometimes it calls it a test because it's not just a scan. Is it will indicate what parts of your brain are working, and from that, inferences can be made. It will not instantly say this person is definitely ADD, but in conjunction with other psychometric tests in which you can literally identify issues that you might have. So, for instance, inattentiveness or easy distractibility or impulse control, well, those are kind of clustered together. By the time you've made that broader psychometric assessment of things in conjunction with these SPECT scans, you are left with a very clear picture of what is going on in your brain. So is it temporal lobe stuff? Is it ganglial stuff? What is the stuff that's going on in your mind? Because once you accept what those are and are conscious of the areas in which you're weaker and conscious of the areas in which you could probably be stronger than most people, you of course can then change your behaviors in such a way as to make it an asset for you. So it's brilliant. I thought it was excellent. This is the kind of book which is worth owning. So, well, literally a family member just got it delivered that they wanted on their bookshelf, and so said, well, do you want to read it first before I take it home? And like, yep. So I unwrapped this a while ago. It took me a long time to read. Okay, I've obviously been lecturing throughout the whole thing, but this wasn't a 60-second book review. It was a full-on half hour of reading, but totally worth reading and owning. Anyway, if that was interesting, do give a follow. Bye-bye now.